Hi everyone, welcome back to Think BRICS. Today's special guest is Cyrus Janssen, a YouTuber many of you surely already know and follow. Hi Cyrus.
Hello, Anastasia. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you for joining our conversation today. Well, we are really excited to have this conversation with you, Cyrus.
Yeah,
Welcome to the show.
pleasure. Thank you for having me. I'm excited as well.
Okay, maybe there are someone who doesn't know you. Well, for those people, let's start with your story.
Sure, sure.
You have
So,
got this fascinating background. Your
yeah,
German mom of yours introduced you to international travel.
yes,
And then in 2007, you moved to China, to Shanghai,
yeah,
to pursue a career as a golf professional,
correct.
right? How did those early experiences shape your journey into business consulting and eventually becoming this bridge builder between the US and China?
Yeah, great question. I grew up, with an international family. My
Yeah.
mother's from Germany, so we'd go to Europe every summer. Always taught to be more of a citizen of the world. So yes, I have a U.S. passport, but I always consider myself a world citizen. I'm always interested in seeing countries around the world improve. I want to see China do well. I want to see Russia do well. I want United States to do well. Germany. We only live in one planet, right? We only have one world to live in. So why don't we find a way that all of us can benefit and that humanity can benefit? So this has been a very key understanding and very key principle for me in my life and how I try to do business as a bridge builder. When I went to China in 2007, I began my career there. It was an amazing opportunity because this was right when China was opening up to the world. China was really growing very fast economically, and I had seen so many of these false um, perceptions in Western media, especially with Western people. Many Americans, for example, believe that China was still riding bicycles and everyone was wearing a Chairman Mao business suit. But in reality, China had developed so fast, and this is something that still today, I still think there's a lot of misconceptions about China. I think there's a lot of people that don't understand China. If you don't understand something, a lot of times you actually end up fearing China. And we see this in the media. A lot of people are told to fear China, that China wants to take over the world. And so I think when you actually get on the ground, you actually talk to Chinese people, you actually go and experience the economy there, you experience the society. It's very, very different than what Western media tells us every single day. And this is really why I started a YouTube channel a few years ago. I said, I have this experience of living abroad. I've traveled around the world, and I want to share people, my message, and I really want to be that bridge builder to hopefully, make a better world for all of us to live in.
It just reminds me how the world perceive Russia. So a lot of countries still think that we have no electricity here, only soldiers, bears, and alcohol drinks.
Yes, yes. I mean,
So,
it's
so vodka.
Yeah, well, it's even interesting in Russia, like every in American movies, right? Every bad guy, is always, Russian. It's always tends to be, we always perceive Russia in a very negative light. I've met many Russian people, and everyone has been fantastic. I've had great conversations. Everybody has been very welcoming. Like Cyrus, if you have time, come to Russia. And so I haven't been to Russia yet, but I would be very open to that because again, I always want to make sure that I experience a country myself instead of listening to the media to tell me how I should feel about that country.
Well, one day you are here. Be our guest, please.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
So, Cyrus, we have been following your content from the very beginning of our experience on YouTube, and you've been covering BRICS for a long time.
Yeah.
Let's talk about something both of us have been discussing recently that's getting a lot of attention. BRICS is planning to launch their own precious metals exchange. You have called this a brilliant move that challenges the dollar's dominance. BRICS control massive amounts of critical resources. We are talking about 72% of rare earths reserves, 70% of cobalt. So, how important is this commodity control to their vision of creating a resource backed financial system? What do you think?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And I think we're really seeing a lot of this right now in this trade war that is going on between the United States and China. Earlier this month, the big news was obviously China has passed a new law stating that they will now have a export license for the rare earth minerals. So they're not banning rare earth minerals, but they're basically saying that if you want to access those, you now need to have a license for that. You now need to basically get approval from Beijing so that Beijing knows what you're going to be using this for. So this is an interesting one because in the United States, our media tells us, the US is the most powerful country, we don't need anybody else, we can do it all ourselves, make America great again. But when you actually talk to businessmen and you talk to people in these industries, you realize that, we actually live in a global economy. And that global economy, what that means is that we actually depend on these trade relationships. So, a good example, rare earth minerals are not actually that rare. Yes, you can find rare earth minerals in Australia, in China, in USA, in Canada, throughout Europe. Russia has many, but it's the processing of these rare earth minerals that is really the difference maker. So, and I found this very interesting. A lot of facilities around the world can process up to 99.5% purity, but only the Chinese can process to 99.9%. So it seems like a small difference, but just that zero point 0.4 percentage, that is the difference between being able to use that mineral in advanced technologies, for example, like semiconductors or advanced weaponry and things like that. So you really have to have China's technological skill set here in order to process that to 99.9%. This is a huge difference maker, and this is why, for example, in April, we actually saw the Ford Motor Factory in USA actually had to shut down for a couple of weeks because they could not get access to the materials that they needed, and they had
Wow.
no other place to go. So literally, if the Ford factory in USA shut down for 2 weeks, they were not able to get the chips that they needed in order to produce the cars. And so again, I think for BRICS, getting back to the question here, this is an amazing opportunity because I think what we're going to see in the future is that these resources are going to be the key for the future. For example, everyone's talking AI right now, right? Like AI is the future. Everybody's developing AI. Well, what is the most important thing for AI? It's actually electricity, right? In order to power AI, you need to generate a tremendous amount of electricity. So if you look at the United States, for the last 20 years, our electrical grid is almost the same. So we've had almost zero increase in electricity production, but the usage has gone up. So the prices are very, very expensive for electricity in the United States. Meanwhile, China has turned to wind turbines. It has turned to hydropower dams. It has turned to nuclear reactors. So, for example, uranium is going to be very, very crucial for the future. So I start to think of what is going to be the future of our economies in the next 10, 20, 50 years. It's going to be these resources. And so it's going to be things like uranium, cobalt, the processing of fine rare earth minerals. So this is where I think BRICS really has an amazing opportunity because at the end of the day, if you're a developing country, if you're an advanced country, you're going to need these resources. That is going to be the key to that. And again, this is why Africa, which has a lot of these minerals, we always say Africa is, is actually the richest continent in the world because it has all of these minerals. And so again, a great opportunity for BRICS and in the future.
Yeah, you're right. If just to mention about uranium, the United States buys uranium, enriched uranium from the Russian Federation.
That's correct. Yeah.
So
Yeah. And
American atomic energy goes thanks to Russian uranium.
yeah, yeah, that's actually a point that I'll bring up that quickly. Actually, the New York Times had an amazing article about this. That obviously for the better part of 2.5, 3 years, we have sanctioned Russia. We basically cut off Russia from the Western world. But interesting enough, we spend hundreds of billions of dollars, with direct payments to Moscow for the uranium because actually about 25% of the power in the USA is generated from nuclear, and without Russian uranium millions, tens of millions of Americans would not have electricity. So this is the thing that is not often talked about in the media, because we don't want to say, hey, we need Russia, right? Again, it goes back to my point, this global economy. And this is something that I find so difficult for this trade war. I mean, as you can imagine, I'm not a supporter of Donald Trump and his tariff war, the trade war, because it's going back to hundreds of years ago, where trade was not easy. So as a nation, in the 1600s, you couldn't do trade easily. So you had what you had, right? You basically produced from the land that you had. Now, is obviously we can buy from anywhere in the world. Trade is very simple, and I think our world has gotten better because of trade. But this is just another great example of why we should be building a better relationship with every country, including Russia, because again, the United States couldn't survive without Russia, and that's something you won't hear, but that is the truth.
Yeah, everything is interconnected. And
Yeah,
if we often say here in Russia that even if one day Russia decides to ban, not the United States decides not to buy or buy somewhere else. If the Russian Federation decides not to sell, so the electricity in America, the prices of the electricity in America will skyrocket.
correct, and we've seen
It's
that.
it's not it's not about who will have or who will not. It will all about who has the money to pay or not.
Yes, that is true. That is true.
Okay, as soon as we are we shifted to your home country, let's talk
Yes.
about Trump administration. We cannot uh, avoid this conversation. You have been critical to the U.S. Foreign policy, something, and sometimes you compare it into like a schoolyard bully, you call them, or
Hmm.
feudal warlord.
Yeah.
So, like when tariffs get slapped on allies such as India, pushing them toward other partnerships. What real structural changes does the US need to make in its foreign policy to actually earn trust from global South nations? We are talking just I don't know, beyond the just talks. What needs to fundamentally shift, in your opinion?
Yeah, there's a lot that needs to shift, actually, I think, for the United States and especially the US foreign policy. I don't think that it can actually happen, to be honest, because the biggest problem in America is that we have an arrogance issue, right? Our politicians, we have this thing that is called American exceptionalism. And it is this belief that we are exceptional. We are the number one country in the world. We're better than every single person. And our foreign policy, our politicians will literally say, the best foreign policy is America first. We should always be the winner. And if you allow America to win, then we'll allow you to prosper, but we have to come first. And so I find this a very difficult message to agree with, even as a US citizen. And I'll tell you why. Because my wife, for example, she's Canadian. So when we lived in Canada, I was very critical of the Canadian government, because the Canadian government, it always will do anything the United States asks for, right? Anything the US asks for, it will, even if it does not benefit Canada. So for example, a few years ago in 2017, 2018, Canada was involved in this very controversial arrest of the Chinese CFO, Meng Wanzhou. She worked for Huawei. She was the CFO. And basically, the United States, kidnapped her. They arrested her on foreign soil, and they basically forced the Canadians to do this. So, what happened is that Canada was involved in this very complicated personal matter between the United States and China. And I simply said to my fellow Canadians, I said, the government in Canada should step up. Why involve yourself in a dispute between China and the U.S.? But America has that leverage. America said, "You do what we tell you to do, and you do it now." And the Canadians said, "Okay, no problem." And that's what I have an issue with, is that countries around the world, they always have to stand up. If you're Germany, you should, and you're the leader of Germany, you should have Germany's interest first. If you're Russia, you put Russia's interest first. If you're China, you're obviously putting Chinese interests first, but you're also looking to build partnerships. Now, the interesting thing, my expertise is China, and so, for example, we saw earlier this year, we saw 63 of 64 nations in Africa actually pledged their allegiance to China. Now, this was very interesting. Why is China so popular in Africa? Well, it comes down to the simple fact and how China deals in diplomatic relations. For example, if you are, let's say, Kenya, the country of Kenya. If Kenya goes to the United States, sometimes the leaders are not treated as well. But if the Kenyan leader goes to China, they roll out the red carpet. They have the same treatment to the president of Kenya as they would to the president of Russia, to the president of the United States. They treat everybody on an equal playing field. You'll have an official state visit, you'll have a very nice thing. And what China does is they treat all of these individual countries in Africa as countries. Meanwhile, the United States, we simply say, Africa, you guys need this, okay? And so, for example, a couple of years ago, Joe Biden, they were hosting the U.S. Africa Summit. And Joe Biden simply addressed all the countries there. He said, okay, I'm going to tell you what Africa needs, and this is what we're going to do for Africa. But the problem is Africa is very diverse, right? It's so many different countries there. So, what Kenya needs is going to be very different than what,
South
Uganda
Africa.
needs, South Africa. Every country's different, right? Egypt's there, South Africa. I mean, there's so many. So I think I said 53, 64. I think it's 54. So it's 53 of 54. So I mean, you have 54 countries in Africa. I mean, all of them have very unique, diverse needs. So the United States, again, we host a summit, and we simply say, this is what the United States is going to do for Africa. Meanwhile, China actually hosts 54 individual meetings. China says, we're going to meet with every leader independently. We're going to actually see what your country needs, and we're going to see how we can work with you on a one-by-one case basis. Because that's what you need, right? Because again, every country in Africa is going to have a different need. So it's little things like this, and I think that really shows you the difference in why African nations. And you'll hear this from many African leaders. They'll say, we love dealing with the Chinese because they respect us, they value us, they partner us, even if it's somebody small, a very small developing country, in Africa. A lot of times, the United States, they say, we don't need you guys. You guys are too small. We don't really care about you. We just want to work with the big countries. We actually saw this was an interesting case study. There's a small island nation, the Solomon Islands. Okay, Solomon Islands are off the coast of Australia. The United States never had an embassy there. Interesting enough, there was actually a lot of bombs left over from World War II. So the Solomon Islands government said, hey, United States government, can you please come in here? We have children that are going out in the fields and they are actually dying because they might step on a landmine, they might find an old bomb. And, World War II, I mean, gosh, that's 80 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Like, this is 2020. At the time, this was 2023. He said, here we are 80 years later. Can you come and clean this stuff up? Basically, the United States said, no, it doesn't bother you. Your country is not important to us. Solomon Islands means nothing. All of a sudden, Solomon Islands shifted to China. China said, you know what? We're going to build an embassy there. We're going to build buildings there. We're going to invest in you. And then all of a sudden, USA said, oh, whoa, 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 wait a second, wait a second. Actually, we're interested now. How about we build a US embassy? And by the way, can we send some people over there? Maybe we can start cleaning up those bombs that you guys acted. So this is a classic example of the United States. They don't care about the Solomon Islands. Why does the US make this change? They only make the change because China's there. And that was the catalyst. That was why, that they finally said, yes, oh, guess what? We're interested to clean up the bombs. Really? You had an opportunity for 80 years to do this. We've been asking you for a long time to do this, but now you only want to do it because China's here. And this is a classic example of why countries around the world, most specifically developing countries, are choosing China because they get a genuine deal. They can actually talk to people. And I always say this, Chinese are very pragmatic. China does not care about your politics, right? You could be a monarchy, you could be a democracy, you could be a constitutional this, you could be a dictatorship where all it matters. China says, look, we're going to do a trade deal. You give us A, we give you B. We don't need to talk about politics, right? In your country, you run your country the way you run your country. We don't care, right? We're China. All we want to do is we want to
Mutual
do a deal.
benefit.
Yeah. So
Mutual
you
benefit.
mutual benefit, right? So, and I think that's another reason why countries in Africa respect them. Because again, who am I to tell you how you should run your country? I don't know your language. I don't know your culture. I don't know your customs. I don't know your history. How am I to say that democracy is going to work for your country? We saw this in Afghanistan, right? The United States came in and they said, we are going to force you to go to elections. We are going to force you to have a democracy. Whether you like it or not, you will have democracy. And guess what? It failed. And people are like, wow, I don't know why it failed. Why did it fail? Well, do you know anything about Afghanistan? It's not going to have these American style elections are never going to work there. That's just not how the country, goes, and that's not the culture. So again, I think this is where I think in order for the U.S. to really improve, which I hope it does. Again, I'm a U.S. citizen. I want the U.S. Foreign policy to improve, but we have to start respecting other countries. We have to start learning about other countries, and we have to really start working for a win-win partnership. That's what China's done, and that's why China's successful.
Yeah, you're right. We are talking about China often on our YouTube channel, and often we say that China has an approach for mutual benefit and mutual prosper. So their motto is I prosper if you prosper.
Mm.
If your benefit is my benefit. So that's why they're
Yeah,
working together with countries just to bring them something they have and do business. But
absolutely, absolutely.
if we are talking about BRICS, Trump says he doesn't like BRICS. He often says that. But then his policies seem to accelerate de-dollarization. Just a couple of days ago, he went to Asia. It was an ASEAN summit, and there were some BRICS countries, of course. But every attack Trump does on BRICS seem to make this group stronger. Is it just chaos, or could there be some 4D chess game happening there? Maybe it's even a way to work around the so-called deep state, while actually Trump supporting a multipolar world. I don't know. It knows. I know that it sounds a little bit conspiracy theory, but what do you think?
Well, I think there's no question that Donald Trump does not like the BRICS organization, and I think it because what does BRICS do? BRICS represents a threat to how the world once worked, and let's go back to when we talk about the unipolar world, and so for a long time, really since the end of World War II, the world largely existed in a unipolar world. Now, unipolar simply means that there's one superpower. So after World War II, obviously Nazi Germany was destroyed. All of Europe needed to be rebuilt, and there was a lot of changes that needed to happen in the world. The United States was an amazing ally to Europe, right? They pledged billions of dollars. They helped rebuild Western Europe. They really tried to advance that. But of course, there was an advantage to the United States. After World War II, the U.S. said, "Look, we're going to create these financial systems. For example, we're going to create the SWIFT system, which means that any time we're transferring money around the world, we are going to use United States dollars." And this is a very important thing for the United States because it meant that no matter who you are in the world, you're going to have to purchase US dollars, which obviously makes the US dollar very, very strong. This means that every country in the world now has to have a foreign currency reserve full of US dollars. So for a long time, this was a very, very beneficial thing for the United States. Then a few years later, the United States makes a deal with Saudi Arabia. Look, we'll provide you military protection. All right. A lot of people don't like Saudi Arabia. Don't worry. The United States, we got your back. We're going to protect you militarily in exchange that any oil that you export from Saudi Arabia, you do so in United States dollars. Hence, that's when the petrodollar was born. So again, you have these policies that really gave the United States a lot of leverage. This is why the United States can have $38 trillion of debt and still function as a country because we're keeping dollars in circulation. And so, any other country I think would collapse with this much debt, but because of the system, it basically allows the United States to keep printing money. It allows the U.S. to still have that leverage because, again, if you are two countries that are doing international trade, a lot of times you need U.S. dollar. So now things are changing, right? For a long time, China, the United States was the only superpower. But then the multipolar world came, and China came, and China's rise has challenged the United States. It's challenged the United States in many ways. I think the biggest way that it's challenged is that it's proven to the world that there is other ways to become a successful country, right? In the United States, we preach one message. The only way that you can be successful as a country is you have to have democracy. Okay, that is a common thing that you will hear. It is taught to us in the textbooks at school. We literally have textbooks. It's like democracy, good; communism, bad; evil, terrible; enemy. So you have, from a young age, we are taught that anything non-democratic is evil. And so this is a very common thing that we are taught from a young age. This is why, many people, again, would fear Russia, would fear China, because, oh, it's not a traditional democracy, like the United States, where, that operates that. But, interesting enough, there's many countries around the world that are
And
democratic, but don't operate like the United States. So I think I think what China's really proved to the world is that, look, we can do things our way. Right? We're going to have a socialist society that is going to embrace capitalism. Right? There's still a lot of business in China. There's still much wealth created in China. There's still billionaires created in China. But a lot of the important industries in China are maintained and managed by the state. And so this is a thing where we talk about electricity, right? Like if you go to electricity in China, it is very affordable because the state realizes that, look, we need to make sure that there's a basic quality of life that everybody can afford. So when you go to China, you look at food prices, you look at gas, you look at petrol, you look at water, electricity, even high-speed internet, which is now considered kind of a basic,
indeed,
necessity in China. All of these are very affordable. Very, very affordable. I mean, you can have unlimited 5G, internet on your phone for literally just a couple of dollars a month in China, which is absurd, when you compare these prices to the United States. I'll give you an example. I mean, even in the state of Nevada, where I live in the United States, during the summertime, electricity bill will routinely be over 1,000 US dollars for your monthly electricity bill. Now, granted, it's very hot in the summer. People are running the air conditioner usually, almost every day. So, but this kind of extreme pricing is non-existent in countries like China because this is not looked at a profit center. This is looked at as a basic need. So the state is going to control that, and it wants to make sure that everybody has these basic needs met. And this is really important. This is very, very important. So again, I think with BRICS, what's happening right now is that there's a lot of interest around the world. The interest in BRICS is growing so fast. And where's it coming from? It's coming from these developing nations because they see China as an economic model. They're seeing, look at, for example, the EV industry. Look at how China has transformed electric vehicles in a relatively short time. We're talking about 10 to 15 years' time. China has gone from zero to hero. And they have really done an amazing job changing that. Now China is going around the world. They're building EV factories. They're building tremendous amount of cars around the world. A great case study, the United Kingdom. Last month, actually, I'm sorry, for the first 9 months of 2025, BYD sales in the UK is up 880% compared to last year. 2 years ago, BYD didn't even exist in the UK. Now it is the fastest growing car brand. And the British are like, wow, we just can't believe the affordability, the technology, the quality, everything is better than anything we can buy. And it has changed the quality of life, for many people in the UK. And so it's a classic case study. And so I think with BRICS, and why Donald Trump is very fearful of this is because, again, there's many countries around the world that want to do more trade. You're starting to see, currency swap agreements. So, for example, we
yeah,
look at Russia and China, tremendous amount of trade between the two. Almost all of it is not done in US dollar, right? It's done in, the Chinese and Russian currencies, respectively. And there's a lot more currency swap agreements. There's a lot more deals being made. And so again, it goes everything back to the minerals exchange. Maybe we can start exchanging minerals. Maybe we start exchanging our own currencies. Everything to diversify away from the U.S. dollar. And let's also look at the price of gold, which I think is a major story this year. Passed over $4,000 an ounce. But you have to start looking at central banks around the world. They are also saying, look, we don't want to hold so much U.S. dollar because the US is a bully. We just know that. The United States will bully you if you do not fall in line with their policies. they have too much leverage. So let's diversify. Let's start buying a tremendous amount of gold. And this is why another big reason gold is up so much is because central banks around the world are buying the gold as well.
Yeah, you're right. About China and Russia, yes, 90% of bilateral trade is in local currencies, in
Right.
rubles and yuan. Now, India buys Russian oil using yuan also.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
Ethiopia recently changed their loans from dollars to yuan.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
borrowing in yuan.
Yeah.
So,
It's fascinating. It's a fascinating world we
yeah,
live in. Yeah,
the
it's it.
dollarization is going on and
Yes,
on. It's unstoppable.
sure. I agree.
But if we continue talking about conspiracy theories, I guess you, Cyrus, deal with this too. When we say something positive about China, people say, "Oh, you are paid by Chinese Communist Party."
Yes.
Say something good about Russia. Oh, KGB is behind you.
Right.
If you are talking something, I don't know, say something critical about China, Indians. Oh, it's CIA. CIA,
Yes.
you are CIA spies, shields. So,
Yes.
well, but let me be clear. Only the only source of income for us it's our viewers.
Yes.
So if you are enjoying this conversation, enjoying our channel, please hit that like button and subscribe not to miss our next episodes. So let's back. Cyrus, you are known for pushing back against negative Western narrative
Yes.
about China, but you also try to stay objective. So let's balance a little bit. What's something about modern China that you think is genuinely problematic or you don't like? Maybe something in domestic policy, culture, society you would like to see different, or Chinese government may change.
So
What,
basic.
what's your take on China?
My take on China. Yeah, I think I do want to address that first part that you mentioned though is that we live in a world right now where if you say anything positive about China, immediately you're a CCP shill. You're getting paid by the government, and I mean, and it's funny because I think if you look at my history of who I've been accused from, I've been accused of being paid from China, from Russia, from Hamas, from and also from the CIA. Oh, you're now colluding. If you say something again positive about the U.S. and then it's like actually I've been accused by being paid from the German government, from the U.S. government, from the Canadian government. I mean, when it was funny when I first started my YouTube channel, you know. And I was covering that Meng Wanzhou case in Canada, right? This was the big thing between USA and China. There was a big trial. I was actually down there, I just happened to be living in Vancouver, and so there was a big trial between US China right in my backyard. So I just went down there and I started interviewing people, and people said, "Oh, this guy definitely getting paid from China. Like they must have sent him there. Why else would an American be living in Canada?" And I'm like, guys, like my wife's Canadian." And I've been living here for 5 years. It's not like I came over yesterday, right? But it's kind of a sad thing because I think it's very similar. Like I always say there's two types of foreigners. Those that have been to China, and then the second type is those that are convinced. The first group is just brainwashed. So the second type of foreigner, they just can't process it. They just can't understand that China can be advanced, that China can be safe, China can be a lot of things that we just never imagine it to be. And I think that's a and that's why my message is always very clear. You need to go travel the world. You need
Yeah,
to experience it yourself, and don't let my YouTube channel, don't just take everything that I say as okay, Cyrus is right about everything. Take I'm trying to provide you one aspect, right? I'm trying to provide you some more nuance about the subject. But the best thing, go to China, go experience it for yourself. I think with China, what I would like to see, I think the biggest thing for China would be, to embrace a little bit more of their past and how they've improved. And I'll give you a good example of this. I remember there was an interview with a very famous Chinese actor. He's actually immigrated to Canada. He actually became a Canadian citizen. And so, he basically said, when I was growing up in China, this was been in the 1980s, China was poor. Like I didn't have shoes. I barely ate anything. Like China was a really poor country. But at age 10, I had an opportunity to go back to go to Canada. I went to Canada, became Canadian. Very grateful for my life in Canada. But obviously, like I'm ethnically Chinese. Like I'm proud to be Chinese.
Of course.
And so, but China. China banned that interview, and they said, we don't want somebody saying that China was poor. And I said, that's not a good thing because let's face the reality. In the 1980s, China was very poor. China was not as developed. So I said, you need to take that criticism and realize it's not really a criticism, but realize that it's just simply a fact, and you can actually use it as almost like a advantage to you, right? Yeah, China was poor in the 1980s. Guess what? In the 1970s, China was one of the top 5 poorest countries in the world. But now you fast forward and you see how much more rich and prosperous it is. That's actually a strength. It's not something that you need to hide. It's actually something that you should embrace. So I've been criticized from Chinese people saying, how dare you say that we were poor in the 1970s? And I said, but you were poor. Like that's not. And it's not an opinion. That's a fact, and it's actually not. It's nothing wrong to say that, but it's actually okay because now look at how you've improved and how you've made progress. That's the story, right? That's the story that we want to share, and that's the story more people need to understand. So, I think there's a lot of I mean, I think China right now, I mean, I think what I want people to understand is that China has a lot of domestic problems that they're trying to deal with. For example, we look at the declining population, right? China right now is 1.4 billion people. By the end of this century, China is projected to have 800 million. So that means that China's population is going to decrease by over half a billion people in the next 75 years. That's going to be that's a big problem for China. Now, how are they combating that? Well, China is also leading in robotics, right? And you start seeing the manufacturing sector. We start seeing factories, employ a lot more robotics. And so, there's different challenges that are, going to be that China's going to have as the population is rising in age. Medical is going to be a huge need to really further develop that medical industry because you're going to have so many aging people. We also see, for example, the real estate crisis. The real estate has consolidated a lot. I mean, I was living in China at a time when real estate was appreciating 20, 30% every year. And it was almost this like, oh, buy a house. It's always going to go up. It will always go up. And so there was a lot of speculation in that. Obviously, we experienced that in the United States. 2008, everybody was buying houses. Everybody thought it can only go up. It will only go up forever. But then, of course, the reality comes in. The housing prices start to collapse, and there's a bottom that has to happen. So this is China that's maturing. This is an economy that is maturing. It's not the same as when I first went in 2007, and the economy was growing at 14% per year. China's growing closer to 5% a year. Still very good, but not the same as before. And the market's maturing. And again, there's a lot of things that China needs to manage for the future. So again, I think when we're talking about this, I'll say the same thing. United States, we have a lot of problems. We should focus on our problems. China, they have a lot of problems. They should focus on their problems, right? No country's perfect, but I think when you start worrying about other countries and trying to think about this and that, you start losing focus, right? The president of China, he has to take care of 1.4 billion people. That's a big job. Him and the governments, they need to figure out how to run that country, and that's their problem. That's their challenge that they're going to need to do.
I see. Thank you very much. Actually, I didn't know about that. They care so much about the that story that they were poor, and it's nothing shameful about it.
No,
Yes, they
nothing.
were, and
Yeah,
look, they made huge, enormous step forward just in 30 years. In 30,
yeah,
it's nothing. If we take history, what does it mean? 30 years, nothing.
yeah, yeah. Exactly.
China did. China did. And they
Yes,
should be proud of this step.
agreed.
Well, but okay. The last question, final one.
Sure.
And this one is for the entrepreneur in you. So you talk a lot about how the future is being shaped by high tech and advancements in China and the BRICS countries. For Western small and medium sized companies looking now at these markets, especially sectors like electrical vehicles, AI, or renewable energy, what's your most actionable advice? Beyond just keep in mind, open mind. What should you actually, what they should actually do?
Yeah, I think a couple things. I mean, I think for example, the first thing that would say is that you want to make sure that you're diversifying away from the U.S. dollar. I think that's a really important one because I think that what we're seeing is that the U.S. dollar has always been the global reserve currency, but the value of the U.S. dollar has declined a lot, and so you need to have investments to make sure that you are taking into account the inflation and the loss of purchasing power. So, for example, I mean, we talked about this is why central banks are buying gold. So again, like I invested in gold because it's an asset that will keep its value, right? You're always looking for the storage of value. What can we buy that can actually store the value and actually keep up with that? So again, I'm looking at emerging markets around the world. I still think that there's a lot of opportunities in Chinese companies. I think that when you're looking at again, when you look at the United States, there's actually a very big bubble that's forming right now, and the United States economy is really, really propped up by the AI bubble right now, and this is actually a major problem that I think is going to really um, if I can give a prediction, and this is kind of what I'm looking at, I think that there's a lot of money circulating around these big tech companies. We have a thing called the Magnificent Seven in America, right? These are the biggest seven stocks. So this is Nvidia, Tesla, Microsoft, Meta, which is Facebook. You have these, basically these seven stocks have around 35% of the entire stock market's value. So there's a lot of evaluation. This is why Donald Trump says, "Look, the stock market is doing amazing. The economy is great." No, it's not true. There's seven stocks that are doing really amazing. The rest of the economy is not actually doing that well. Just on paper, we can look and see the stock market. Okay, the stock market's up 13% this year. But when you take away those seven companies and you start looking at the data on the ground, it's actually very different. There was a Harvard professor that actually published a new paper a couple of weeks ago. He said that in the first half of 2025, if you take away the revenue generated and from the AI data centers, because that's obviously fuels a lot of this GDP growth, is we're building an AI data center, we're building this, building that, building that. So again, on paper, the economy is great. If you take away this AI data centers, he said the U.S. economy for the first half grew at 0.1% in 2025. Right, all of the economic growth in the U.S. is coming from this one sector, so it actually is an outlier. It actually doesn't represent the real economy, and this is why, again, when people say, this is why Donald Trump's message, "Oh, stock market's doing great, economy is doing great, I'm a great president," it's not as simple as that. We have to look at a lot of the data, and so I think what we're seeing is I think we're seeing a lot of companies like, for example, Microsoft is spending half a $300 billion on these GPUs from Nvidia, who's then building this with Meta, who's then basically it's this circulation. All this money is just kind of going back and forth between all of these AI companies, and so the revenue looks great. It looks great because we're generating all this revenue. Actually, we're just passing the same money amongst all these big companies. And so I think there's going to be a very big bubble here. I think this bubble is going to pop. I do think that AI is amazing. Don't get me wrong. I don't think that AI is a joke or something. I mean, I think all of us are using ChatGPT, and we're using different platforms. But I think that what's happening, the interesting thing is you should start looking at China. China is actually taking a different model. They're making everything open source. And we saw that actually, that was the biggest story that happened earlier this year. In about March of this year, DeepSeek came out. And they basically were able to do everything that OpenAI was able to do, but they did it on a shoestring budget, right? OpenAI said this took us, $300 million to make. China said, well, we did it in 5 million. And guess what? We did it open source, which means anybody can use it and anybody can have it. So we're not even going to try to like make a ton of money off of this. We basically just want to make this for everybody. Actually, one of the biggest tech companies in America, Airbnb, very big tech company. They rent out all of the apartments online. Airbnb, they actually revealed that they can't use OpenAI software because it's not as advanced enough for them. They're actually using Alibaba's Quen software system, which is actually quite remarkable. So they said that they're actually using Alibaba's AI as the pillar, as the center of that, along with some other AI tools. But it's actually Chinese tech is actually powering one of America's most important tech startups. That was a big story that broke last week. And you can start to see how that would not be well received in America. But like, why is Airbnb trusting this American or this Chinese company? But again, it's open source, it's very powerful, and we need to use what's the best for us. So again, I really want people. I think if people are watching this channel, Thinks Bricks, which by the way, Anastasia, you and your team do a great job. I'm very honored to be here with you today. I'm a big fan of your work. I think you guys do a great job because
Thank you.
what I know with this is that people are very interested in BRICS. This is why I cover it on my YouTube channel as well, and they're also interested in learning how to prepare for a world that is not going to see the United States as number one. I think you're going to see United States will continue to be a very powerful country. That's no doubt, right? U.S. economy is still very big. U.S. U.S. is filled with amazing companies, amazing people, amazing culture. The U.S. government, I just feel, is not very well run. I don't feel that it's very well run. I don't. I'm not. I'm very. What I like about America is the people and when you actually spend time in the United States, you'll hear the same thing. The best thing about the U.S. is nothing to do with the government. It's about the individual people and the companies that we are running. And so that's where kind of a funny story. This is where I say, I saw on Twitter the other day. It's like, China hates America. China wants to see America fail. And I said that is propaganda, because if you go to China and you talk to Chinese people always are, when I say, "Oh, Cyrus, where are you from?" I'm from the United States. They will always say, "We love the United States. We love Americans like you. Thank you for coming to our country. The only thing we don't like is the US government." And I always joke with them. I say, "Don't worry. Neither do I." And most Americans don't like US government either. So actually, this is something we have in common. And so I think that's and this is kind of where it goes back to my work, is that I mean, I'm not a fan of many governments around the world. There's very few governments that I think are great, and again, that's why I tend to focus more on people to people diplomacy, right? Like if I'm going to go to Moscow, for a visit, what am I going to do? I want to go to the streets. I want to talk to people. I want to see what those people are like, and I'll say, "Hey, what do you think of the United States? What do you think of me as an American?" I'm pretty sure people in Moscow would be very happy to meet me. I don't think they would be unwelcoming, because if you treat people with respect and you're kind, at the end of the day, people in Moscow, people in Beijing, people in Los Angeles, we actually all want the same thing. Right? We want to have a better
Yes.
life, right? We want to have, hopefully have a family, hopefully our children live a better life than we do. Maybe we can make some money enough to go on a holiday one day, spend some time with our kids. We want to see progress. I think that's pretty much universal wherever you go in the world, right? And so I think we tend to spend too much time on politics. And I'm not going to debate, is Russia's government better, is China's government better, is US government better? Why don't we all talk about our lives, and why don't we try to connect? And why don't for example, if I'm in Russia, I'd like to go for some Russian meal. I'd like to talk about your culture. I'd like to see how people in Russia, how you're living your life, and I'd like to learn about your culture. I had a similar thing where I went to Azerbaijan this summer, former Soviet Union country. And I learned so much there. And it was interesting because actually I did go to a Russian restaurant there and I spoke to a lot of Russian people, and it was great. It was great. But I learned a lot about that country. And I knew nothing about Azerbaijan. I knew nothing about that country before I went. But I found people that were very, very passionate about their country, very optimistic for the future. And it really taught me a lot more about the world that we live in. And so it was a really great trip because it helped me as an American that again considers myself a world citizen. It really, inspired me, to continue working here hard on YouTube, and just try to, promote a world where we're all winning. Anastasia, that's what I do. So thank you for your hard work, and thank you for today's interview. It's been a pleasure to chat with you.
So, Cyrus, thank you very much for joining us today.
My
Well,
pleasure.
it has been a really insightful conversation. Thank you again. And we would love to have you again at our channel.
Sounds good. I'll be happy to be there. Thank you so much for the interview,
Thank
and
you
thank you
so
everybody, and we'll see you in our next episode.
Thank you.
All
So,
right.
to everyone watching, thanks for tuning in to our channel today. If you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, and see you in the next episode. Thanks for watching.